I'm here with laptop reviewer and programmer Just Josh to find out what makes a good programming laptop in 2022. So why don't you introduce yourself a bit and tell us why we should listen to you?
Thanks, Jared. Well, it's really good to be here in Australia, especially in these times. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm Josh from the YouTube channel, Just Josh. And I've had a background, a long history in software development. I have 2 degrees in computer science, and I did software development professionally in a number of different companies for close to 15 years. Now, in full transparency, Jared, and I always like to be very transparent, now I'm more on the product management side of software development. So I'm still working with developers, obviously, every day, but I'm more on the product management side. That being said, spending a lot of time reviewing laptops as well, and I always have that, that bent in my head about looking at things from a software developer's perspective, because honestly, that's what got me to start my channel, because I personally was looking for the best laptop to do software development on. So let's get into it.
Yeah, well, makes sense. I mean, if you know what makes a good laptop for programming and you've tested a lot, I guess you probably have a pretty good idea.
I hope so, but there are a lot of differences between what different software developers are looking for, but hopefully today we can cover a bit of that.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think the number one thing people ask me when they're looking for a laptop for programming is, what CPU do I need?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question because, unlike, say, for gaming, where if you want to play AAA titles, right, you really do need a pretty baseline, decent GPU, right? On the software development side, on the CPU side, most software development, a lot of it, especially for students, can be done on any modern processor, particularly those that are, say, Intel i5 and above. They do work quite well for most common software development tasks. Like in the old days, integrated development environments, compiling code, all of that took a good amount of time. Nowadays, the difference, at least in my testing for, say, Java, right, doing, say, corporate software development, you're talking in a number of perhaps seconds in terms of compile time. And when I say comparing between, say, a lower-end Ultrabook, say an i5 CPU, and an upper-end Intel H series, higher-powered one. But, as we look at it, there are a number of other factors to consider. So with a software developer, we've got to think about how we actually use computers. A lot of times we're looking at code on the screen, we're trying to solve problems, and that doesn't need a lot of CPU power to do that. It's really when we're actually testing what we're developing that becomes into play. And as I said, for most CPUs, you're talking about a number of seconds. But if you're really doing a lot of professional coding at a professional level, those seconds do add up, right? Yeah. So I think my favorite CPUs going around right now, I do like the Ryzen 5800U CPU. I think it has an excellent balance of performance versus the wattage it's using. So the laptop doesn't get too hot under load, and that can be annoying for a software developer because you got your hands on the keyboard deck the whole time, assuming you're using the laptop's keyboard, that is. So any warmth, you're really going to feel it when you're sitting there doing coding for hours on end. But I'd say the other CPUs I would, think are pretty good. I think the M1 Max, when I say Max, I mean the Max M1, not the MAX Max. The Max chip itself, which is the higher end M1 chip, it gets a little bit hot under load. So, I don't think programmers need that. I'd look for something like the MacBook Pro 13 with the M1 chip, or even better, the one I have here, the MacBook Pro 14 with the M1 Pro chip. It runs cooler than the M1 Max, and for programming tasks, it's plenty powerful. So those are probably my 2 picks for CPUs right now. But as I said, and I'm reiterating here, if you're a student, don't be afraid of buying an i5 Intel CPU. Even the 11th gen going around right now, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, sounds good. And I guess just thinking about what's probably going to be coming later this year, I'm guessing AMD will probably refresh the 5800U with like a 6800U or similar. So it's probably going to be a pretty similar type of deal there in terms of like core and thread count. I guess what is interesting to me is Intel 12th gen is obviously coming out in 2022. And that's just going to increase the core and thread count significantly. So how do you think that would help with programming?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I didn't touch on that much. For, I would say, common basic software development, say you're in a corporate environment, you're joining together lots of different APIs and things like that. When you're actually developing the software, honestly, I find personally, single-threaded workloads is more common today. So having faster single-threaded performance, actually you'll probably notice that a little bit more. That being said, there are a number of tasks where multi-threaded really does help. So for instance, let's say you're testing concurrency, right? Multiple programs running at the same time, and you're looking for issues around that. In that case, obviously having multiple cores and multiple threads is certainly going to help. Other examples might be you'll be running different VMs, virtual machines, on your computer to test, again, the interaction between the virtual machines. Again, multi-threads and multi-cores are going to help there. So I'm also very excited, of course, Intel 12th Gen. So I think we've got a really good thing coming for programmers. I really do think the CPU performance is great. And I think the part that I'm really watching is honestly the performance per watt.
Yep.
How fast can I get the laptop to run without it getting uncomfortably warm to the touch? And I think, Apple's done great with the M1 Pro here, this particular laptop. It's really very comfortable to use for those tasks.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see what the 12th gen mobile processors do, because having tested the desktop side, both the single core and multi-core performance is significantly better, both compared to what they had before, but also compared to AMD Ryzen. But as you mentioned, that performance boost doesn't come for nothing. It does use significantly more power, at least when under heavy multi-core load. So yeah. That we'll have to see how hot they are.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be very interesting if you kind of start to look at capping that wattage. How much performance are you going to get with a lower wattage than which we're going to probably face on the laptops, right?
Yeah.
So it's going to be very interesting. It's a big year coming.
Yeah, that's for sure. So the next thing I wanted to ask about is the GPU. So you kind of touched on that before. So I guess just full disclosure for me, when the last time I've done any programming would have been 10 years ago in university. So I'm kind of out of the loop, and my laptop then didn't really have, good graphics at all. So is that something we need to care about?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of reasons you'd want a GPU as a software developer. For a lot of software developers, GPUs probably aren't going to be that important. Here are the use cases where I believe they are, right? One is you're similar to me, where you do software development, but you also like to game on the side, right? And obviously, esports titles, you're probably going to be able to get away with the integrated GPUs that are coming with most laptops today. But if you really want to game at a higher level or play some AAA titles, obviously it's great to have a GPU. Watch Jarrod's channel, obviously, to find a great gaming laptop for you. So, and there is that nice crossover between a high-performance gaming laptop and what a programmer would want. So, that being said, obviously gaming laptops tend to be bigger, less portable, and programmers often like portability. So if you're gaming, we got that one covered. The next one, of course, is if you're developing games, right? You're doing software development for games. That's another example of where you'd want a good GPU. And then the other one, which I think is starting to affect more software developers, is on the ML and DL side, particularly deep learning. So this is when you're using artificial intelligence to read potentially tons of different images. You're looking for certain patterns and things like that. Now, in that case, CUDA from NVIDIA, actually a lot of the libraries that you're using are very optimized for CUDA. Now, realistically, most deep learning is run on much more powerful computers than certainly the gaming graphics or the GPU graphics you're going to get in these. That being said, having a GPU that you can run CUDA on will enable you to test some of your models on your laptop, which can be quite helpful. So those are some examples of when I'd consider a GPU for a programmer.
Yeah, makes sense. So it sounds like you're going to ignite the age-old AMD versus NVIDIA debate there.
And you heard me, I think, honestly, with on the deep learning side, it's realistically, NVIDIA is more optimized right now, so it's going to swing it in that favor. But if you're not doing that kind of software development, you just want to game on, you could really choose either, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about, in terms of the NVIDIA side, I guess they obviously have like GTX and RTX hardware. Is there any sort of benefits in terms of the programming side for ray tracing, or is that just mainly for the gaming still?
Interesting. I don't know. If anyone who's watching this and knows in the comments, place it below and perhaps we'll pin it so other people can find out. That's a very, very good question. I'd love to know the answer.
Yeah, me too. I guess at the end of the day, it's probably not going to make a whole lot of difference because it seems like NVIDIA is really pushing towards having all their products being RTX anyway. So
true.
I don't think it will be that big of a deal. It seems like they're kind of phasing out the GTX stuff. But of course, if you want to get an older model, secondhand, that kind of thing, it might be something worth considering.
Yeah, and that's possible, obviously. Like a lot of software development is done overseas in markets that can kind of maybe trail the US and some of the other markets in terms of what hardware they're getting. So that still could be quite viable. Yeah. That question. Yeah, it's an interesting one.
Okay, so next up is how much RAM do we need? Is 4 gigs enough? 8 gigs? 16? 64? What do we need?
Certainly not 4. Let's put that one. Let's put that one aside in today's day and age. 8 gigs is an interesting one. As I said, a lot of software development that you're going to do at university, or some of the back end kind of software development that you might be doing. Even 8 gigs you could probably survive. That being said, I do want to be really clear about this. Compared to a normal user, a software developer is running a lot of baseline applications that other users just aren't running. And these are quite RAM intensive. They're running IDEs, software development environments, right? So they might have all the normal applications that someone has open, web browsers, multiple tabs, Office applications. But then on top of that, they've got software development environments, the integrated development environments. They're running the actual code that they're testing. That might load a lot into memory as well. So I would really say, I'd more say 16 gig is probably the minimum I'd like to see. Now, obviously, we'd hope your laptop is upgradable so you can whack in more RAM if you need be. But if it isn't, I would really like to see people more on 16 gig. Now, once you go to more like 32 gig and above, that tends to be more specialized software development. You've got to ask yourself, how much data am I loading into memory? And you should know that question, right, as a software developer. If you don't, getting 32 gig obviously gives you more flexibility in the long term, right? You'll be able to use the laptop for coding tasks that you might not be doing today, but you might be doing tomorrow. So look, more memory is always better. Obviously, we'd love to see you with an upgradable laptop. And unfortunately, many don't, have soldered RAM. So I would say 16 minimum, but as much as you can afford within your budget, assuming your laptop isn't upgradable.
Yeah, sounds good. And definitely worth keeping in mind the upgradability aspect, because a lot of Ultrabooks these days just seem to not have upgradable memory at all.
Yeah, it's tough. It's great to see the framework laptop out there. That really surprised me this year. And that was very positive. Hopefully pushes more manufacturers in the right direction there.
Yeah, I'd love to see more of that.
Yeah.
So next up, storage. How much space do we need? Can we get by with hard drives? Do we need SSDs?
I definitely suggest SSDs as a software developer. You're loading, when you think about something like a Java environment, most projects are composed of multiple different files. You don't want them spread out across your hard drive and then having to look at seek times and all that kind of stuff. So definitely SSD for sure. I would say, again, it's kind of similar to my answer for RAM. A software developer is going to have a lot more stuff on their computer than a normal user is. So I would say, even 512 is probably pushing it on the minimal side. I'd like to see a bit more. And again, it depends on the type of software development you're doing. So let's say you're, you're doing software development for a startup, right? But it's a pretty decent sized startup, and you need to download their entire production set onto your laptop to test. Maybe there's an issue in production that you need to test, right? You've got to bring down their entire database, perhaps, onto your local machine, and you might want to test it. Let's say, now, of course, you could connect to an external server, right, via the internet or whatnot in the cloud, but what happens if you don't have an internet connection and you want to debug? Say you're on the plane, so you're traveling somewhere. It's just, you want that kind of reliability that you can really bring the data you're going to need to test applications onto your computer. So I would say probably I'd like to see people on a minimum of 1 gig. Did I just say 1 gig? I'd like to see people on a minimum of 1 terabyte. Now, realistically, a lot of SSDs in a lot of laptops today are upgradable, which is good. So I'd say probably aim for 1 terabyte, particularly if you're getting something like this, which is the MacBooks, where they're not upgradable.
Yeah, I guess at least unlike memory, the SSD is generally less common. It's less likely to be soldered to the motherboard. There definitely are small laptops where that is the case. But yeah, I guess also in more Ultrabook style form factors, you're probably only going to be looking at maybe 1 M.2 slot. So yeah, keeping that in mind, and maybe looking at something that has 2 M.2 slots so you can just easily add in another one could also be a benefit.
Yeah, and I think also the other one that I was thinking as well is, I mentioned deep learning before. You need a lot of different images to test the models on, and images take up a lot of storage space. So that's another example where I'd like to see software developers on more. And of course, again, virtual machine environments, right? That all takes up both space on the SSDs, and also it chews up RAM. So again, software developers, it's kind of like you grab what RAM and what SSDs most normal users would use, and then you got to take it up a notch realistically. Yeah.
Makes sense. All right, so what about the screens, given that's probably what you're going to be staring at all day while actually writing code, right?
Yeah, that's the guys, I got to be honest, if it takes a little bit longer to compile code, right, by a second or two, you're going to notice that less than if the screen isn't great. As a software developer, most of the time you're solving puzzles on the computer, you're looking at the screen, you're typing on the keyboard, you're scrolling on the trackpad or mouse. Those are the things you're really using all the time. Yeah. And I would like to backtrack on the CPUs a little bit and just say one thing. Look, You don't want the CPU to be so slow that you start multitasking while you're waiting for code to be tested, because that's distracting, then you forget where you were. You don't want that. But as long as it's good enough, it's good. But on the display side, which we're talking about right now, you want to see a lot of code on the screen. And here's why. When you're debugging code, you've got to keep in your mind, how does this algorithm work? And if you can't see enough code on that screen, you can't kind of decipher how it's working. You've got to scroll, or you've got to double click in, or things like that. And you've got to remember, well, how did this method or function work, and now I'm looking at this one. But if you can see it all on the same screen, it kind of makes it a lot easier. So on the display side, the clarity of seeing the most amount of text on screen is super important. Now, that's not just one thing. I don't want people to be distracted by, hey, it's a 14-inch laptop or a 13.3-inch display, because there are so many factors that go into how much text you can see on screen. There's the aspect ratio, 16 by 9, 16 by 10, 3 by 2. There is the amount of pixels, obviously the resolution, there's the brightness. All of these things factor in. So something like the MacBook Pro 13 with the M1 chip, it's a great coding laptop. You'd be surprised because you'd think it's only a 13.3-inch screen. Yep. But those other factors I mentioned are very strong, so you see a lot of text on screen. That's why, for instance, on my channel, I always have a graph, or I try to show how much information, like I use Excel to show how many rows you see on screen as a proxy to how much code you're going to see on screen. So I'd like to see you guys with certainly a mont display with a resolution higher than 1920 by 1080. I'd love to see you with at least 400 nits of brightness, and preferably an aspect ratio like 16 by 10. I think that's a nice middle ground. 16 by 9, not as much information going down the page. 3 by 2, if you're using your laptop to watch movies, you're going to see big black bars above and below. So that's really what I'd be looking for.
Yeah. Does refresh rate come into it at all? So obviously on the gaming side, we care more about having smooth gameplay with like a 144 hertz screen. I guess with coding, maybe you scroll up and down and it looks nice and smooth. Maybe that's not that important.
I think you've used the optimal word there, which is nice, right? That's a bit of a nice to have. It would be great. One thing I do want to mention is what I found this year. We saw these, finally, high resolution displays with fast refresh rate, and most of them were 1440 panels, as I recall. Yep. And one thing to be aware of on a 15.6-inch display around thereabouts with a 1440 resolution, I personally, I don't know about you, found I was stuck in windows of going 150% Windows scaling, where everything was a bit too big and I didn't see a lot of code going down the screen, or 125% where everything felt a bit too small. So that resolution, it's a bit of I'm assuming it's pretty good for gaming, because is that right? You probably get quite immersive and you get high refresh rate.
Yeah, I think 1440p is a good sweet spot, especially once you start getting higher than, say, 15 inches, because then there's just more pixel density. I think 17 inches, 1080p, sitting at a normal distance, you can kind of see the pixels. So I'm guessing that might not be good for looking at text when coding, for instance.
See, that's the thing. Realistically, as a coder, I'm really looking forward to when there's more of those I've seen a couple of them, the 4K 120 hertz panels. Yeah. I'd like to see more of those, because that's going to have a lot of clarity for coding. You're not going to have that issue that I mentioned where you're stuck between 150%, 125% scaling. Obviously, guys, you can change the fonts within applications, but as a coder, you're installing so many different applications that can get quite annoying. But I'd like to see something like, the 4K 120 hertz. When they become more prevalent, that'll be really good sweet spot for coders. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't say too much, but there are definitely some more laptops coming with that panel this year, so hopefully there'll be more options.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'll certainly be watching your videos to see that as well.
Yeah, so. Cool. All right, so speaking of things that you're using all the time on the laptop, I think the next one we should cover is the keyboard, because that's what you're actually using to type.
Yeah. Look, guys, it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. A keyboard is super, super important for a software developer. You just don't want it to feel uncomfortable, and that's why I personally stayed away from a lot of the Apple MacBook Pros and the MacBooks in general. I'd say the new Apple MacBook Pros with the M1 Max and M1 Pro chip, the 14-inch, 16-inch that just came out, their keyboards are finally at a level I'm very comfortable with using. But any keyboard that's going to have, say, low travel, you're definitely going to feel that as a software developer when you're trying to type as fast as possible. I would say, any keyboard with an odd layout, like say, keys are in a different place or they're not the right size, that's going to get very frustrating very quickly. And then other things like this year, I hit a lot of laptops in my reviews where I had light-colored keys with a light-colored backlight, making them very hard to see from certain angles. Again, that's going to get annoying very, very fast, especially if you're coding in an environment where it's a little bit dark. So you really, really want to get a very good keyboard.
Yeah, makes sense. I guess even if you don't have the world's best keyboard, you could always plug in like an external mechanical keyboard, for instance. Obviously, that's less portable, but I guess if you're at home or the office, maybe that might end up being better.
Yeah, that's certainly something I think most people should really do. Anyway, it's just fantastic. It's just a great thing.
Yeah.
I certainly use a mechanical keyboard. I think you do
me
too.
too.
Yeah. They're just honestly, it's just that feeling, right? You just I feel like I'm typing faster. It's more exciting to use the computer. That being said, as a coder, in a lot of environments that I've seen coders code, especially in corporate environments or working for a company, once we get back to the office, people are often coding in different places around the office. And some places, they don't have a lot of room to put a mechanical keyboard, or you want that portability. Say you're going to a meeting room and a bunch of people are coding in the same room. You've got to solve an algorithm, like a problem, or debug something really quickly. You've got a bunch of people working together. It's one of those things that having a good keyboard on your laptop and a good mechanical keyboard is great. But I'd like you to have that baseline of a good keyboard on the laptop. I do think it's really important.
Yeah, and I guess just something I thought of when you mentioned people getting together to work in like an office environment, for instance. I know from experience, just having a loud mechanical keyboard, not everyone in the office is generally going to be a fan of that.
That's a very good point. And funnily enough, on the Zoom calls and the numerous conference calls we're all doing today, with my mechanical keyboard, I get so many complaints of people saying, hey, it's too loud, and I have to quickly mute myself. So, yeah, that's a really good point, actually.
Yeah,
another reason to get a great, better laptop keyboard.
Yeah. I guess just going into like Zoom meetings and stuff, I suppose a webcam might actually be pretty important in terms of like online meeting.
It is. I mean, I got to say this, that, certainly in a corporate environment or a software development environment, when you're working with lots of different people, honestly, the way you come across your personal brand can make a big difference. And if you're like fully, washed out, or the camera's looking up your nose, or you look disheveled, it kind of communicates this message that perhaps you don't quite have things together. So I think having a good webcam, being professional on camera, which obviously having that quality webcam will help. It does matter in today's day and age.
Yeah. And just speaking about upcoming laptops this year that will be announced at CES, from what I have seen, it does seem like a lot of companies are taking the camera more seriously. So there are both more options that are going to 1080p rather than 720p. And also, a number of those nose cams have been moved up to the top, so I think that's great to see.
About time. We're looking at a laptop right here that's a great laptop, but it's got a nose cam, which is just, who wants to be working in it? Like, say you're working in a Scrum team, which is a team of software developers led by a product manager. Say you're working in a team like that, and you've got everyone on webcam, and yours is up your nose. Like, people don't want to see that. So that's great news.
That'll be good.
Yeah.
All right, so is there anything that we need to care about when it comes to port selection? Like, are there any devices programmers might need to plug in more so than someone else?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I don't, compared to someone like a video editor, I don't think there's a lot. I would mention the following ports, right? I think at a minimum, I really like USB-C charging, and I think having a laptop that has that gives you so much flexibility. When you're walking around, whether it's a co-working space, an office space, going to meet someone, you can use someone else's charger, which is great. Or you can buy a very lightweight, cheap USB-C charger rather than having to carry potentially, that laptop obviously has a pretty big, heavy charger. So I think having USB-C charging is great. Plus, of course, many mobile phones. This is the Samsung Ultra. It supports USB-C charger, so only one charger, for both. So I think that's an important one. I'd say the next one is, as Jarrod and I already talked about, having an external keyboard could be great. Having an external mouse is honestly really good too. And a lot of these they connect via USB-A still, right? Not the USB-C port. So having a USB-A port can be quite good. And then the last one I'd say is when you're presenting in meetings, having an HDMI connection. A lot of offices still today are using HDMI. They haven't fully switched to DisplayPort over USB-C. Yep. So having that can be quite useful too.
Yeah. That's something I found as well. I just remember working back in the office and there'd always be someone frantically trying to find a dongle.
Yeah.
Right, so Type-C charging is obviously definitely a benefit. Less power brick to carry around, that's always a plus. So what about in terms of like battery? I'm guessing that's probably going to be pretty important too.
Yeah, it is. I think, again, it depends a lot on the use case, right? So I think if you do get that USB-C charging, right, which is a lighter weight charger, moving around with the laptop and the charger is not that big a deal. And a lot of corporate offices, they do have, even in the meeting rooms, they'll have PowerPoints. That being said, there are tons of use cases where having better battery life does help. It really does as a software developer. Let me give you some examples. You're a student going to class and you want a backpack that's as light as humanly possible. That would be a good example. You do a lot of travel, For me, I've traveled across the US a lot, and that trip is around 5 to 6 hours. And if you're doing software development on that trip, it's going to push the laptop a little harder than just sitting there watching a video. So because of that, it's going to drain the battery faster. So if you want to get full battery life on that trip, you've got to have a good battery. And yes, some of the plane seats now, thankfully, are coming with power points, or charging ports. But, realistically, a lot of them, planes still don't have it. Some, if they do have it, maybe it's not working, and you don't want to be stuck on a 5 to 6 hour flight, without being able to do what you intended to do. So I do think battery life is quite important for a software developer. I really do, yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. So I guess there's kind of two aspects I think about when it comes to battery. So there's obviously how long does the battery last, but then there's also actual performance on battery, because obviously in most cases the difference between being plugged into wall power or running on battery could be pretty different.
Yeah. I'm going to go with this one. This is an interesting one. I think it's always good to be able to control it. And I think every manufacturer that choice should be given to you, right? They shouldn't assume how you want to run your laptop on battery. And that's just a given.
Yeah.
That being said, if the laptop did lower performance, on battery, it really depends by how much. I've seen some pretty horrendous I think that laptop in particular, one of the ones that lowers the battery. Lowers the performance a lot on battery. It depends how much, right? If it lowers a little bit, as I said when I was talking about CPU performance, a lot of what you're going to do, you don't need the CPU, right? You're looking through code, you're scrolling through code windows, you're looking at different algorithms, you're maybe researching different APIs. You don't need high performance when doing that. And if you have to wait a little bit longer for the code to compile and test when you're running on battery, maybe you're on an airplane like the example I gave, you'll survive, But as I said, it really depends on how much. Manufacturers just shouldn't do that. It should be a choice. I know I'm reiterating myself, but it really should be. Yeah.
Yeah. Just speaking from some personal examples. So when I test performance of, say, Intel and Ryzen processors, generally what I've found is the Ryzen processors typically, not only do they last longer on battery, but they also still perform better on battery, at least compared to Intel. Though that is comparing Intel 11th gen rather than 12th gen, which is coming out this year. And who knows, maybe that'll turn things around completely with the whole P and E core situation.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, and I have also heard that the M1 stuff, generally, you basically get full performance while still running on battery.
That's right, you do. I've, just on this, I kind of mentioned this before, I think the M1 Max chip, when I've tested that, I have two 14-inch of the Apple MacBook Pros, one with the M1 Max, one with the M1 Pro. I found a pretty large difference in battery power with the M1 Max. Yes, you do get full performance, but it chews battery pretty fast. Honestly, I get some pretty bad battery scores. The M1 Pro, I got a lot better battery, and certainly the M1 chip on the MacBook Pro 13 and the MacBook Air, that one performs very well on battery life. And yes, Jared, to your point, you get full power. So those are some good laptops, processors to look at. Yeah.
Cool. Good to know. All right, so you've been talking about the M1 laptop quite a bit. So I guess I've got a Windows laptop here, and what I'm thinking next is operating system selection. So should someone doing programming be looking for Windows, Linux, or maybe Apple?
Yeah. That's a very good question. I do want to be transparent with the viewers here. Even though you see me talking about the MacBook Pro a lot today, and I have one in front of me, back at the hotel room, I have the Legion Slim 7. And that is just an absolutely great Windows laptop. So I'm actually traveling with two laptops right now, Windows and a Mac. But let's get into the meat of the question, okay? So I think the first thing as a software developer you need to ask yourself is, are you going to code for native applications in Apple's ecosystem? We're talking about native iPad applications, native iPhone applications. If you are, you got to get a Mac. End of story, right? Now, if that's not the case, then you've got a really good choice on your hands. And you've got to look at a variety. No laptop is perfect. You've got to look at a variety of factors as a software developer. I think this laptop, the M1 Pro that I have here, the MacBook 14 with the M1 Pro chip, is really probably the best laptop for coders going around right now. The aspect ratio of the screen is great. You see a lot of information on screen, good webcam. Pretty much everything we've talked about today, it has. Where its downsides are, being a Mac, is the current Apple laptops no longer support booting into Windows or another environment.
Yep.
Now, a lot of software developers are going to like to use Linux. And having a computer that supports Linux, that you can run Windows on and Linux, is really, really good. And I'll just give you some examples of why you might want to run Linux. One, as a software developer, you love tech, right? And with Linux, you're really getting in. It feels good to use that command line and really have complete control. The other reason you want to use Linux is kind of like the reason I was using Linux, is a lot of software today is running in the cloud, or it should be running in the cloud. And having a laptop with Linux, you can realistically run the same operating system as you're running in the cloud, because a lot of these cloud servers are running Linux. And that means when you test code, you have a real certain degree of accuracy, or that is accuracy the right word? Or you have a good degree of confidence that the code you're going to run is going to run on the server that you're intending to code it for. Now, of course, you can run VMs. You can make your code as part of a Docker container, which is obviously going to help with all that, but that's other layers that you're going to put on your computer. So having the base computer as the same operating system, it does help. Now, so we've talked about Linux, we've talked about Mac. On the Windows side, Windows is great because obviously you have a huge amount of software that works on it, which is really, really good. And just going back on the Mac a second, make sure that your software does actually run on Apple's new M1 chips, because some software still, a lot of manufacturers of software are taking time to update it. So Mac, great for coding native, great for a high quality programming machine. I personally believe right now the best programming laptop is this one, which is a Mac. On the Linux side, I think you've got a lot of flexibility. It's fun to use. I think, as I said, you can match the server you're coding for. And then on Windows, you've got the breadth of programs. Plus, Windows PCs are the ones you can run Linux on. So there is quite a degree of choice. It's really up to you as to what you want. So that's my perspective on operating systems for laptops. There's a lot to think about. Hopefully I've given you something that'll help you make your decision, but it really is up to you and, what kind of software development you're going to be doing.
Sounds good. So I guess just to kind of wrap it up, do you have any suggestions for, say, like a low-end, mid-range, and then a high-end option for programming? I guess, of course, keeping in mind that right now this is early 2022 and there is about to be new Intel and AMD processors launching. But presumably these models, I guess, will probably be refreshed with the new hardware.
A couple of laptops kind of spring to mind right now at the lower end. I think, certainly... I'm going to go against the grain here and say the MacBook Air is one that springs to mind. It is a little bit more costly. It's $900 with some of the discounts you might see on Amazon. Even though at the lower end it only has 8 gig of RAM and doesn't meet some of the specs I've mentioned, it is on many other dimensions a very good laptop for coders. You see a lot of information on the small screen. It has excellent battery life. There's a lot of good things about it. And also, Apple's OS has always done very well with lower amounts of RAM. So I am going to throw that one in there. But on the PC side, something like, I kind of like the Asus Swift X. Nothing's going to be perfect in this price range, and that does have the keyboard problem that I mentioned, where the keys can be hard to see in certain lighting conditions, but you get a lot of hardware for the money you're spending with that laptop. I also like the IdeaPad 5 Pros. I did a review of some of the bigger ones of those on my channel. Again, a lot of bang for the buck, very high quality laptop that you're getting. Not the most perfect laptop, as I remember the keyboard wasn't amazing and I'd like a better keyboard, but again, at that price range, you've got to make some sacrifices. And the other laptop at the very low end, the HP Pavilion Aero, that one, especially with the 6-core Ryzen processor, you get a lot of performance out of it. You can, again, a lot of bang for the buck, ticks a lot of the boxes that I mentioned today. So moving up a tier, and I've got some notes here, by the way, on some laptops. I'd say my favorite ones in the kind of like the mid-tier. Framework laptop. I've done an interview with the founder of my channel. He has a long history of software himself. It just really ticks a lot of boxes that a software developer would use. Phenomenal Linux support, fully upgradable. The screen is really good for a software developer, both the aspect ratio, the clarity, all of those kind of things that come into play. The only downside of it is, of course, right now, it only has an Intel CPU, but they do tell me that in the future they are going to provide different CPUs available to it, and the CPU is upgradable in it. The other laptop that springs to mind, MacBook Pro 13. I like that better than the MacBook Air for a software developer, mainly because it has a fan. The MacBook Air, in my testing, even the M1 one, it doesn't have a fan, so it can get a little bit warm to the touch at times, especially when you're doing performance-related things. The MacBook Pro 13 does have a fan, and using an app like Max Fan Control, you can turn on the fan to solve that. The other laptops I'd like to mention here, or at least one more, the IdeaPad Slim 7 Pro. It's definitely a very high quality laptop. It's a notch above the IdeaPad 5 Pro. It's also known as the Yoga 14S. Lenovo calls it different things in different regions. Great screen. That does have a fast refresh rate panel. It's just a really good all-round laptop. The only downside of it, honestly, is the keyboard is a little bit, it feels noticeably lower travel, right? Up in the higher tiers, there are a couple of laptops that really scream to me about these would be great coding laptops. This one here, the MacBook Pro 14, this is the one with the M1 Pro chip. I've talked about it a bit today. The only thing I'd note is, as I recall, you can't get 32 gig of RAM with the M1 Pro chip. You need to go to the M1 Max chip. And that M1 Max chip, I have the 24-core CPU model on my the 24-core GPU model. I have it, the 14-inch one. I don't have it with me, but you lose a lot of battery life. It gets a lot warmer, so I'd avoid that model. If you do want 32 gig of RAM, I'd go for the MacBook Pro 16. That's an excellent one. I really do like it. It has much better cooling. It has a bigger battery inside, so it solves a lot of the problems that putting the M1 Max chip with 32 gig of RAM in this chassis does. So those are two laptops I'd look for: MacBook Pro 14 with M1 Pro, MacBook Pro 16 with M1 Max. And then on the Windows side, I actually quite like this laptop. You know, I've talked about it a lot. Having a big 4K screen on a 17-inch laptop, you see so much code, it's fantastic. That being said, I kind of like the MacBook Pro 16 better. It is also heavy. It's not as heavy as that one though, but it's still a little bit more portable than that one. But I still think that's a very, very good laptop to get. And then the other one, I'd say probably the Alienware 17X. Again, you got a lot of, these are beefy laptops, a lot of high-powered components, a lot of upgradable components, which is great. Seeing a lot of code on screen. I mean, these are fantastic laptops to code on.
Yeah, sounds good. And I guess obviously with a lot of those higher end options, you can also do some gaming on the side, as you mentioned, because you get the higher end GPU.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, as mentioned, a lot of these laptops are probably still yet to be refreshed in 2022 with new CPUs and GPUs. It might be possible there are other changes, like as mentioned, new webcams and keyboards and that kind of thing. So, are you going to be reviewing any of these new models perhaps during 2022?
Absolutely. I'm really excited about some of the new laptops coming. I think, this year we did see a lot of really good laptops, but as I mentioned when I went through the laptops I recommend, a lot of them do have still gotchas, right? You've got to choose you can't really get the best of everything. And I'm kind of hoping that this year, I mean, there's always going to be next stuff, right? There's always more to look forward to. But I am hoping that they close the back door on a lot of things that were just clear issues this year. Like, as I said, the different, the light-colored keys with the light-colored backlight, webcam, sound, keyboards feeling too low travel. I'm hoping that they close the back door on some of those kind of gating issues in the laptops for next year. And I'm very excited about being able to review some for everybody. So that should be good. So
make sure you get subscribed to Just Josh if you're interested in programming laptops. So he talks about laptops from the perspective of programmers all the time. So definitely a good source of information. So yeah, thanks for coming over and helping people decide what they need to pick in a laptop in 2022 for programming.
Yeah, and thanks, Jared, for having me in these crazy, crazy times. This has been a wonderful experience to get to do this rather than, each of us sitting at home solo in our YouTube studio filming, just talking to a camera. So this has been a very nice surprise. So thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming.